RoH, Part 4, Scene 10. Karen waited in Trian's lab room, pacing and unable to calm her nerves. Her mother was 61 years old. Was that too old to survive the drug? It had nearly killed the man, Talon. She'd used it on 6 years ago. That was why, this time, she had lowered the dose significantly, so that shouldn't happen again. Was it enough? Was it too much? Had she adjusted properly for her mother's fitness? What if her mother had an allergic reaction? She'd only had 9 years with her birth mother, and it would be intolerable to lose her now simply because she made a mistake with the dosage. She sighed. As she paced, she passed high tables with stools stacked on top, making them look a little like looming figures in the dim. She got to the end of the aisle and turned around again. It was a scream from outside. It was the kind of scream that crawled up your spine and made your whole being shiver, the kind where you knew someone was dying. She turned to look across the room. Persons screamed again, closer this time. The lab room door opened and her mother entered. A feeling of absolute terror jumped inside of Karen, and she cried out from its suddenness. There was no thought. All she knew was that her mother was terrified, and Karen stepped forward towards her, trying to ease that intolerable fear. "Stay back," Trian yelled. "Karen, stay back. I don't want you to get hurt." Someone else came in through the doorway, and Karen turned to see a stranger with Dobed's face. Ice blue eyes glanced at her for a moment, and then he turned to grab Trian. The illogical terror dropped away, and Karen could think again. She knew suddenly that the feeling had probably been her mother broadcasting empathically as a part of the ruse. There was a security camera in the roof above Karen, and this was all an act for that camera and Dobed's superiors. Karen gripped the hidden hypodermic needle in one hand and waited. Her mother and Dobed struggled for a few breaths before he pulled her into a headlock. She seemed to be choking. She fought against him for a few moments before passing out in his arms. That was Karen's cue. She ran towards them across the room. "What are you doing? Let go of her!" she cried out, trying to unhook his arm from around her mother's throat. "Stay back," he barked. "No, let go of her." Using his shoulder, he pushed her so she slipped and fell backwards. When she turned over again, her mother was lying on the ground and Dobed was striding away. Karen crawled towards her mother's limp form and checked her pulse. A strong heartbeat pushed against her fingertips, and Karen tried not to show her relief in any way that the camera could see. With her body between the camera and the needle, she pushed the one-shot dose into her mother's arm. When it was done, she dropped the needle in her jacket pocket and pretended to start doing CPR. There was a click, and she felt the cold barrel of a weapon touch her temple. "Step back from her," said a hostile voice. She looked sideways into Dobed's face. He barely even looked like himself. In fact, the look of pure hatred in his eyes was something out of a nightmare. Trembling from the shot of real terror that flared up through her spine, Karen lifted her hands and got to her feet. She understood in that moment why he needed such drastic measures to hide his real identity. If this was the man her superiors knew, then the brave, kind man that she knew would likely be immediately killed if his deception was ever revealed. Footsteps came towards them down the hallway, and others entered the lab. People in agency suits, lab coats, and off-duty colours all looked curious and concerned at the woman who lay on the floor. One young woman, wearing a white lab coat, stepped in through the doorway and cried out, running towards Trian as if to help her. Dobed's voice was filled with icy venom. "No one touched the body. She was a traitor." The woman stopped immediately. Wide, dark brown eyes stared in shock. The woman turned away with a hand over her mouth. Karen waited at barrel's end for the official medical team to arrive. Her mother would remain in a near-death state for about 40 minutes. That gave them ample time for the EMTs to do the formal declaration and move Trian's body to the basement morgue. Before dawn, after the fuss had died down, she and Dobed would get her mother out of there to the rebels. Karen knew she might never see her mother again, but at least she'd be alive. Scene 11. Dawn. Trian woke with a terrible pain in her head. Her body refused to move, no matter how much she pushed it with her mind. Eventually, she managed a pained moan. A cool hand brushed her face. She felt the owner empathically push a calm sense of safety towards her. You're okay. The drugs haven't completely worn off. You'll be able to move soon. Promise. The woman sounded young, and Trian felt an openness to her that meant she couldn't possibly be an agent. Dobit. Hmm? A sleepy, questioning sound answered. Your friend. She's waking up. Trian pushed against whatever it was that held her limbs and felt a hand twitch. Her face wrinkled up in concentration, and after 3 attempts, her eyes finally opened. Above her was a blurry face with bright blue eyes. Dobit smiled down at her. How are you feeling? Head hurts, her voice creaked. But I'm free, aren't I? A smile lit up his eyes. There you are. Feeling oddly frail, Trian struggled to sit upright, and Dobit grabbed one arm to help pull her into a sitting position. A young woman stepped around him and handed her a glass of water. Trian smiled, looking up into an innocent heart-shaped face, a pair of dark brown eyes that shimmered slightly with a layer of night vision purple. The girl was a hybrid, part Tolan, part Aranan, and her returning smile was so affectionate that Trian found her own grin widening. She took a glass of water. Thank you. Nalana, said the girl with a little chuckle. I'll let you guys talk. She had a trace of accent as if she'd spent time in Naradan in her childhood. The girl scampered out of sight. The space around Trian was completely empty, except for the couch she sat on, which smelt as if it had a past life as a sponge which had never been rinsed. There were windows to one side of her, but they were covered with old towels, probably to block off the cold. The only light came from several candle holders that burned in the corners of the room. A dark-haired woman, wearing faded black combat fatigues, sat on the carpet opposite her, with her back against a flaking wall. Trian frowned sideways at Dobit. How can you do all of this without getting caught? Mischief lifted into his eyes, making him look very young. Can you guess? She shook her head. I don't know. I'm too tired for guessing games. How about you just tell me? I'm Hawk. She snorted, expecting him to be joking, but the grin on her face dropped when she sensed a sad patience in him. You're serious? Hawk? She stared at him for a moment. What, are you looking for a horrific death, boy? You know better than anyone what Jaran would do if he... I can handle him, Trian. Besides, I'm a 20 out of 5 time psi. Her jaw dropped. A 20? How have you kept your functionality? Across the room from her, the other woman laughed. The jury is still out on whether he's lost from reality, Matrona, but either way, he's effective. Dobit laughed, not offended at all by this woman's insult, and Tree sensed that whoever she was, she and Dobit were very good friends. So, still grinning, Dobit glanced sideways at her. How does retiring in Araman with your nephew Terrace sound? That sounds perfect. But first, what about my daughters? With your death, Karen will lose her job in the labs and she'll be safe as a civilian. I'm keeping an eye on Gwen and Cassandra. However, they're on the run, so I cannot guarantee anything. But you have my word that I will do everything I can to keep Gwen and your granddaughter alive. He was empathically open to her. For the first time since he was a boy, she could see behind his eyes a very strong man, perfectly well, too, and she sensed the pain he was in over his son. Her heart filled with a deep affection for another of her adopted waifs. She touched his face with one hand. I trust you, boy. You know your mother would be incredibly proud of you. He scoffed. I think first and foremost she would be horrified that one of her sons is a rebel. Maybe, but you're doing the right thing and she would understand that. Your father has turned the agency into something it was never meant to be, and I believe you can stop him. Just be careful and stay alive. That little boy of yours desperately needs you. He's too much like you were at his age. Without you, he'll never have a sense of belonging anywhere. Feeling a deep shaft of guilt, she looked down at her hands. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about Little Ghost. Your father threatened... No, he interrupted. You don't need to apologize to me, Trian. I understand, and you are completely forgiven. Now, do you feel strong enough to travel? She nodded. I think so. Good. There's a van waiting outside to take you to a private airstrip. He offered his arm to help her stand, and she took it. Tourist says he's brought some cake sprinkles for you, so you can feel at home when you get there. She laughed. That's my good grandnephew. Scene 12. 8th of Mekra, 3010, the next morning. In Naradan, it's in the southwest of Aram, on the border between Arana and Rona. Ducking down the small gap between two half-completed cars, Lalan swore a string of the most offensive Ronin obscenities she knew. Bullets dented and penetrated the car to her left, and a moment later more hit to her right. She was surrounded. After 3 years on the run from the Ronin Special Guard, the Rona Aban, and more recently the Iranian Agency, it was embarrassingly ironic that it was some silly kid in the pursuit of a loaf of maca bread that were going to be her downfall. So much for her plans to get to Aram and join the Sai rebels. She'd barely even gotten over the border. Lalan reloaded both of her weapons from clips in her pants pocket. The reverberating booms and metallic chinks of gunfire and ricochet tried to get at her through the metal on either side. She thanked all that was good in the world that she'd run into a factory that made proper metal cars, and not those mostly plastic things from Basan. Otherwise she'd be dead already. She threw the spent clips behind her and put her weapons back into their holsters on her thighs. Shuffling forwards towards the front of one car, she had to check her surroundings. North, over a blue car bonnet, towards the front of the factory building, 4 suited Iranian agents had cover. 2 to her left, behind a yellow forklift, 1 next to the main exit, behind a large red shipping crate. The 4th stood in a doorway to her far right. Gunfire sounded and she ducked. There were at least 4 more in the south end of the factory that she'd seen on her way in. By now they'd probably found ample cover in among the machinery. Right, she said quietly to herself. It was time to play hardball. Crouching close to the south side vehicle, she gripped the bottom of it with both hands, added most of her kinetic strength, and lifted the entire car up onto its side. Grabbing a last grenade from a jacket pocket, she pulled the pin and threw it over the tipped car towards the back end of the factory. She ducked and covered her ears. The explosion rocked the foundations of the building and came with a few satisfying cries of fear and pain, as well as a hail of metal and wood debris. That'll sort 'em for a while, she thought with satisfaction. With the south end clear, she turned north and drew both weapons. Firing with the accuracy Goyd had taught her as a child, she hit the agent in the doorway, and he fell with a choked scream. She ducked for a moment and came up again. Pushing hard with her mind, she slid the yellow forklift away from 2 agents and took them out before they could run away. The 4th, an older Iranian near the exit, seemed a little smarter than his companions, and had slipped back behind the cover of the shipping crate. Unfortunately, the crate was a little too big for her to move kinetically, and she wasn't desperate enough yet to waste bullets on the hope that a lucky ricochet through the metal would get him. She sighed and sat back, waiting for the next wave of agents. It was only a matter of time before she'd be overrun. But if she was going to go down, she would take as many of these tween-sized Iranian agents with her as she could. Scene break. Talon clambered up the fire escape ladder behind Nama. They were about 3 stories up, and would be sitting ducks if the agency saw them on the side of the old brick building. But it was the way Hawke had suggested, so they were doing it. They got to the top of the ladder and climbed onto a metal balcony. Talon looked around him as they both caught their breath. The factory was high up enough on the hill overlooking Naradan city to see right across the towers of the central business district and, in the distance, a sliver of blue on the horizon. Naradan was a quiet, sprawling city built on one side of the massive river that formed the entire western border between Arana and Rona. The city had fared a lot better in the 100-year depression than Aram by trading with South Ronan cities over the river. The trading was so successful and free-flowing that there were as many Ronan faces as Aranan in the crowds of the central city. It seemed like another world to Talon, who had never seen a Ronan up close before. They were very tall, averaging over 2 meters, and thus at least a head taller than him. Some of the men were so broad across the chest they were 2 Aranan men wide. Talon smiled at the city below them. They were like ebony giants, beautiful and fierce like their pioneering ancestors. Nama patted him on the back and he turned to survey the window behind them. There didn't seem to be any immediate way in, with the unblemished white metal window frame sitting in crumbling brickwork. It would seem that the fire exit balcony was much older than the window. So much for the safety of the workers in a fire, he thought cynically. Talon shrugged. Maybe we need to just... The balcony vibrated as a fairly loud boom sounded from downstairs. It seemed that explosives were now part of the battle below. Yep. Nama lifted the butt of his rifle and smashed the window. Whoever used to work in the office beyond had left a mess of discarded papers in their panic to get out. Metal filing cabinets hugged all available walls, with many of their drawers still open. Official documents lay crumpled in a chaotic storm around the only desk in the room. Behind it, another window overlooked the factory floor below. They approached the second window and stared at the carnage below. Next to him, Nama whispered a curse of amazement. One side of the factory floor below them was scattered with bodies and rubble from what must have been a grenade. By his count, there were at least 15 bodies lying around 2 shot-up vehicles, with 1 car on its side. The Ronin figure sat crouched between the two, with a number of discarded clips around them and their weapons aimed at the ceiling. They seemed ready for more. Talon blinked. They almost don't need our help. They will soon. Nama patted him on the chest. Come on. The office sat above the steep stairwell, which dropped into near pitch blackness. For a moment as they descended, Talon felt like he was floating down into an abyss, and then the sounds of gunfire led them back towards the light and into a long corridor. At the end of the hall, an agent lay dead in the doorway. The man was probably only barely out of high school. His young face stared blankly at the wall, with his neck in shreds, and body lying in a pool of blood. Nama knelt over the young man to check his wounds. Crack shot, whoever they are, they're good. Carnage on the main floor looked worse from ground level. Bodies and bits of flesh were strewn across the concrete, and the brick wall opposite them had chunks of shredded metal embedded in it. To their far left, machinery and the dead were a single mass in the twisted aftermath of an explosion. No one was coming in from that direction for a while. To their right was a flat concrete expanse with more dead bodies and massive crates of whatever the factory made, spread between the Ronin and an entrance to the building some 20 metres away. All was quiet for the moment. Tay, keep under cover. They don't know we're friendly yet. He smirked back at Nama. Of course. A single shot fired and the bullet hole appeared in the wall right next to his ear. Haida! Surprised, Talon ducked back. Nama shuffled around him closer to the doorway. We're rebels. We've come to help you. I'm not that gullible, bellowed a voice from outside. No, really. My name's Nama Reed. This is my friend Talon. Hawk sent us to help you. Ha! The Ronin fired at their doorway, embedding a few more bullets into the brick wall near their faces. What would Hawk want with me? How the Nooth should I know? Maybe he's in need of a one-person army. It was a snorted laugh. Funny or not, you come in here, I'll shoot you. Nama seemed to see something. Turning in the other direction, he stepped out of cover, lifted his rifle and fired 3 times towards the entrance of the building. Talon stretched to look in that direction and saw 2 agent bodies on the concrete. Standing in front of him, Nama realized he was visible to the Ronin, and his eyes widened over the barrel of his rifle. Talon held his breath. It was a moment of silence, but even though Nama was in plain sight, no gunshot sounded. Rebels, you say? Nama lowered his rifle and turned around to face them. Yep. Come on out, other person. I ain't gonna shoot you. Talon stepped nervously in behind Nama. The Ronin strode towards them with 2 large handguns aimed, but Talon sensed no immediate hostility. She wore dark pants and a t-shirt that was speckled with tiny purple flowers. Over top was a full-length trench coat that blew out behind her as she walked. She had 2 holsters strapped on the side of each thigh in the way Asha preferred, and she wore a dark backpack. Her thick black hair was brushed from her square face to a bushy ponytail. Strong yet graceful, she walked with purpose. Talon's mouth fell open. She was beautiful. She grinned. You mean got an escape route, or do you intend on dying here with me? Talon, Nama elbowed him, and only then did he realise he was staring. Go upstairs ahead of us. Let me know what you see out that window. Blushing as he closed his mouth, Talon turned back towards the stairwell. Right. So, Mr. Rebel, her voice was tinged with an open friendliness. You happen to have a grenade on you? Nama laughed. No, what for? I prefer to exit with a bang, not a whimper. Ah, well. Talon climbed back up into the darkness, and her voice dimmed. What was your cute friend's name?